Good morning. Today's daf is daf Kuf Zayin Mesechus Zevachim. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Ashim and the Schreiber for sponsoring all the Shirim, all the Drashas, and the Schus for a Refuah Shalema for Eliyahu Rafal ben Miriam, Meretz Hashem, and the Schus of our Talmud Torah. He should have a Refuah Shalema b'Meher b'Karev. We also thank Matin Chanalei Margali for sponsoring all the Shirim, all the Drashas in the month of Teves in memory of Mati's father, Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel Ben Kusil Yehuda, whose yard site is on Chavtal Tevis, Mr. Shem, and the Neshama Shem and Aliyah, and the family Shem and Cham. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today. We thank Alan and Andrea Stowis for sponsoring Daf Yomi today in commemoration of the yard site of Alan's father, Menachem Mendel Ben Avram Nassan, and with tremendous hakar sotov to Jeremy Lassen for the great chesed that he provided. Just going to mention quickly or briefly before we begin. A number of months ago, someone approached me and said to me, Rabbi Richter, I have a very uncomfortable question to ask you. I was watching Daf Yomi this morning. Coffee. Does he not fast? So, to mention right now, people will watch this Daf Yomi share throughout the day. It is pre-fast still. So if you see me drinking coffee now, it's because the fast has not started. But in Hashem, if someone could just give us a reminder, there are 2 times for the beginning of the fast. The time that I put on the schedule is 6:14. There's an earlier time of 6 o'clock. So we'll just try to give people a quick reminder that they should stop drinking coffee once the tainus starts. But again, v'hiyisem nekiyim, we should remain without suspicion that we are not drinking coffee on the fast day of Asar B'Teves. It is still before the fast has begun. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakoni b'dvarim. Okay, today's daf is daf Kuf Zayin. And yesterday we began the parak of Hashochif v'Marla. This parak discusses the halachos of Shchutei Chutz. And what we mentioned yesterday is that when the truth is this is relevant to all mitzvahs in the Torah, but if we want to be able to find the source for this issur, we have to find both the source for the azhara, for the warning not to do it, which is the initial mention of the issur, and on top of that we want to find where the onesh is written. We found that very clearly when it came to ha'ala b'chutz. When it came to shchita, we had a number of different suggestions because it wasn't so clear to us. At the end of yesterday's daf, what we said was that we could, although ein mazhirin min hadin, you can't really learn the halacha to warn somebody by virtue of the fact that you made a logical calculation that, there's an issur to do A, so therefore there should be an issur to do B as well. However, when it comes to a gzeira shava or to a hekesh, that's not using your own logic. A gzeira shava or a hekesh is something which is built into the structure of the Torah, and therefore, anytime we're going to have a gzeira shava or a hekesh, that is as if it's written clearly. So yesterday, at the end of yesterday's daf, we had gzeira shava and a hekesh to teach us the azhara for shchita. Now, 3 lines in on Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph. Ashkechan, we found the source for muktari pnim, something which is burnt inside, shehelan b'chutz. Muktari chutz, shehelan b'chutz minayin. How do I know the halacha of things which were processed outside, that were brought up outside? Minayin. Amar of Kahana, Amar Kor, the pasuk says, v'aleim tomar. Or the truth is, little translation of Aleim Tomar is, and to them you should say. So this is a very interesting thing. If you look at Rashi says of Aleim Tomar, Zut Chilas Parshas Ha'ala, Usmucho La Parshas Shchutei Chutz. This is the beginning of the Parsha of Ha'ala, of actually bringing it onto the Mizbeach, and this is very close to the Parsha of Shchutei Chutz. Now, Al Rishonim, the Mishtoi B'Chutz, Sha'amar She'im Helo B'Chutz Chayev, in the previous cases that we're talking about, that were processed outside, and the pasuk is continuing and saying, in other words, referencing those that we talked about that were already done outside, Im Helo B'Chutz Chayev, if you're going to bring them up onto the Mizbeach outside, they're going to be Chayev. V'aleim Karinon. So Rashi addresses the obvious question that the Gemara is going to ask, which is, V'aleim, spelled with an aleph, does not mean, the translation of the word v'aleim with an aleph does not mean with regard to a previously mentioned item. It means really v'aleim, and to them you should say. Rashi says he's understanding v'aleim Karinon, you read it with an ayin. So in other words, they're going to be combined together by the fact that it says Va'aleim Tomar. Now the Gemara says Va'aleim Tomar ala smuchin on that which was mentioned beforehand, which is close by, and then al smuchin Tomar it should be said about which is close by. Now Maskef Rava says very nice. You want to pronounce it that way. Miksiv Va'aleim. Does it say it with an ayin? It doesn't say that. I'm sorry, that's just not the word that it says. If it's not the word that it says, you can't just change the aleph for an ayin. Now again, we don't really hear much of a pronunciation difference because in Ashkenazic Messiah we don't have a difference between an aleph and an ayin. But the truth is, whether you have a different pronunciation or not, one has an ayin, one has an aleph, they mean different things. So the Gemara says, Va'aleim ksiv. What miksiv va'aleim ksiv. It says va'aleim with an aleph. Elak is a taner debei b'shmal, va'aleim tomar, la'ariv parashiyas. In other words, the point is not that we're using the word va'aleim to say, with regard to what was mentioned beforehand, we're going to tell you there's an issur to bring it onto the mizbeach. Rather, what it's telling you is ve'aleim, the vav. So the vav is the vav mosif. It goes ahead, it connects the two parashiyos, and therefore, in any one of those cases, it's going to be a chiyuv for bringing it up onto the mizbeach. Yochanan says, Asya hava hava. Like we mentioned yesterday, we have this hava hava, which is the Gzera Shava. So Mala Allah Muktari Chotz, Avka Muktari Chotz. So just like in that case, it was referring to a case where things were being processed or burned outside. So here also, it includes cases where it was done outside. Okay, Maskula Bibi, Hadatnan. Bibi has a question now. Hadatana, we have a mission that tells us shloshim v'sheish krisus batar. There are 36 cases where a person can do something, and the punishment will be kares. The problem is now that you've added the case where it was done outside plus and v'shavhava, now it's 37 instead of being 36. Why? The ika hamayla, the hamayla. It's the two different types of hamayla. Both cases, whether it was done inside or was done outside, if you're going to burn it outside, it's going to be chayav kares. Gemara says kasha. It's a good kasha. So again, typically when the Gemara says that something is a kasha, it means that it's a good kasha, but it's not the type of thing that it's such a strong kasha that we're not going to be able to keep this drasha. We'll keep it together. V'hadu tanan. Now the Gemara does something very interesting over here. Gemara. It's very atypical for a Gemara to find sources for things that we don't know yet. But the Gemara, what it does is, it takes the mishnayos at the end of this parak, which are the facts of the halacha of shkuti chutz, and find the sources for them over here. So what typically will happen is, you'll have mishnayos, and then after that mishnah that tells you halacha, you can have a minalan, or minahani mili. What the Gemara does over here is, it tells us some of those halachas before we know them. So we're going to have to learn them at the same time. We're learning the source for them, but the mishnayos are later on in this parak. That which we learned later on in the Mishnah in this parak, has zorek miktsas damin b'achotz chayiv. The halach is if a person sprinkles part of the blood of a carbon outside his chayiv. Now again, we learned previously in this Masechta, that when it comes to a zrika, you don't have to do, it's not me'akev to do all of them. We said, matana achas mehen me'akaves. When you do zrika, as long as you do one sprinkling on the mizbech, that's sufficient. That's why it says, if a person zorek, he sprinkles a little bit of the blood outside, he's going to be chayiv. Minalan, how do I know that you're chayiv for sprinkling even a little bit of the blood? Gemara says, nafkalei, you learn that out from a Tanif, what it says in the Brisa, dam yechashev. What's this referring to? It's in the pasuk. As we mentioned before, pasuk, this is Parak Yud Zayin, pasuk Daled says, "Pesach Ol Moed Lo Havio." They did not bring this carbon to the opening of the Ol Moed. Lahakriv carbon LaShem, to bring a carbon to Hashem with the Mishkan Hashem, and says Dam Yechashev Lo Ishahu. The pasuk adds the word Dam Yechashev Lo Ishahu. So the Gemara says, LaRabos Esazarek. The word Dam Yechashev comes to add, it's not only the shkita, it's not only bringing it up on the mizbeach, it's also the sprinkling of the blood, which is a problem. Divi Rabbi Yishmael, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. So according to Rabbi Yishmael, it's learned from the words Dam Yechashev. Rabbi Kiva Omer, and Kiva says, O Zevach. This is not the same pasuk. This is a pasuk. Pasuk Chesed is Valeim. Yeah, it says Valeim Tomar, Yeshish mi beis Yisrael min negar yagur v'sochel asher yala ola ozavach. The extra words ozavach l'rabos is hazorek. That comes to add in someone who sprinkles the blood. So again, everyone agrees that sprinkling the blood outside is going to be a problem. What's the machlokas? We have a machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, whether that's learned from the words dam yechashev or it's learned from the words o zevach. Bishmal, the Gemara wants to know, okay, so according to Bishmal, that you learned it out from Dami Chashev, Hai Zevach, my Avile. What are you going to do with those words of Zevach? In other words, why do you have to have those words there? Gemara says Lechalik, to divide it. In other words, what that means is a person may have thought, if you read the pasuk together, it says, Asher Yala, if it's not going to say Asher Yala Ola O Zevach, I would think it would say Asher Yala Ola Zevach. Then I would learn from there that you have to bring both an olah and a carbon shlamim for a person to be chayiv. Therefore, the word O is over there, lechalik, to divide it, to say, no, that there's a chiv, even if a person only brings an olah or only brings a zevach, he's still going to be chayiv. So according to Rabbi Akiva, who uses ol zevach to teach you the halacha of zrika, Rekiva lechalik minale. How does he know that? Nafkalei milo yivi eno. He learns it up from the words lo yivi enu. Where is that? That's the next pasuk. It says Pesach el moed lo yivi enu. Now lo yivi enu, which follows immediately after the words ola o zevach. Even if you would not learn ola o zevach to say that each individual carbon is a problem, nevertheless, Yivi enu is in singular language. So if you're telling me it has to be an ola, a carbon ola, and a shlamim for a person to be chayiv, it would not say yivi enu. It would have to be plural. Since it says it in a singular language, we learn only one carbon. Okay, so according to Rabbi Shmuel, according to Rabbi Shmuel, that he also has that word lo yivi enu, which is in singular language. So now why does he have to have o zavach mibayile? He needs those words of Yivienu ala shalem hu chayiv venu chayiv ala chaser. A person is only chayiv for bringing a carbon which is a shalem, but not bringing a carbon which is chaser. What does that mean? So you look in the third wide line in Rashi. He says, "Kaman pligiba." Later on, there's going to be machlokas what this means. Iklamad the amar aver chaser. That whenever a person is going to be chayiv for ha'alas chutz, for burning a carbon on an outside mizbeach, that's only if the limb is fully intact. There's an opinion that says this means you have to bring up the entire animal. Is referring to haktara chaser. In other words, if it, like we mentioned before in the Masechta, sometimes a piece could fly off the mizbeach, but ultimately it's talking about if it's missing something that goes off the mizbeach. But the bottom line is, he learns from that word that it has to be completely intact. Now, according to Akiva, how does he know that? Akiva nafkalei milasos oso. He learns that from the word lasos oso, which again is in. Sorry, I just lost my place. Akiva nafkalei milasos oso, which is also in pasuk tes. It says lasos oso. So in other words, he learns out the halacha that has to be fully intact. The words lasos oso. And so now back according to Bishmal, Rabbi Shmuel, Chad l'miktari pnim shechasru v'helu. One of those is referring to l'miktari pnim shechasru. It was missing a piece v'helu, and he brought it up. Bachotz, Chad l'miktari chotz. The other one refers to a case of miktar and bachotz shechasru. In other words, something which is done outside, which lost the piece v'helu bachotz, and then they brought it up in the mizbeach. That's why he has both the single language of lo yivi enu and lasos oso. Now the Gemara says v'hatanya. Now typically v'hatanya. Typically the terms v'hatanya that you will find was always going to be a kasha. But if you look at Rashi does us a favor over here on the fifth line, the second class word says binichusa. In other words, it says Rashi, don't expect there to be a kasha over here. This v'hatanya over here is just simply bringing a raya. Mishmal Omer Yachol Muktari Pnim Shechasru v'Helo Bachotz. You would have thought Muktari Pnim processed carbonates from inside. Shechasru, which is missing a piece, v'Helo Bachotz Chayiv Yibi Chayiv. Talmud Omer, no, Lasus also exactly as we just got finished saying. Al Shalim Chayiv is Chayiv only if it's fully intact. V'Nei Chayiv Al Chasar, he's not Chayiv if it's Chasru. V'Kiva, according to V'Kiva, Muktari Pnim Shechasru v'Helo Bachotz Chayiv. According to V'Kiva, it's going to be Chayiv, which makes sense according to the way we just made this drasha. Now the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, Hai Dami Chashev, my Avidlei, getting all the way back to the beginning. The beginning of this whole cycle that we learned, all these different opinions, these different drashas of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Remember, Rabbi Akiva learned out the halacha that Zrikas Dam outside is going to be chayiv. He learned it from the words of Ozevach. So what does he do? What does he do with that? Where it says Larabos Shchitas Ha'of, that comes to include Shchitas Ha'of. In other words, you have to remember when it comes to any type of bird carbon, the halacha is that inside the Beis Hamikdash there was no such thing as Shchitas Ha'of. When there was a bird carbon, there was Malika, the process done with the Kohen's fingernail. So what he's saying is, this includes a person who does shchita on a bird outside, that will be a problem. For Rabbi Shmuel, according to Rabbi Shmuel Nafkaleh, he learns that out from Me'o Asher Yishchat. He learns that out from the words O Asher Yishchat. Again, if you read the pasuk is pasuk Gimel. It says, "Ish mi beis Yisrael asher yishchat shar kesev eis b'machna." So a person who will go ahead and shecht and slaughter a shar, a kesev, and eis, all these animals, b'machna o asher yishchat michutz l'machna. Why does it have to say O asher yishchat the second time? Why can the pasuk simply just write asher yishchat shar kesev o eis b'machna o michutz l'machna? Why does it have to say Asher Yishchat a second time? So according to Rabbi Shmuel, he says, "Oh, Asher Yishchat." The additional words of Asher Yishchat tells me that there's a chiyuv for shechting a bird, which is typically done with malika. If you do that outside, there's going to be a chiyuv. Rabbi Kiva Amar Lach will tell you that those are extra words Asher Yishchat mibayile. You need them al shochet to chayiv to tell you specifically. You chayiv only if you shecht it below al malek. In other words, even though typically a bird is processed through malika, you'd be chayiv only for shchita outside. Rabbi Shmuel, according to Rabbi Shmuel, how does he know that there's no chiyuv for malika? Nafkalei mizeh hadavar. It says very clearly, zeh hadavar. Therefore, the Tanya, as we learned in the Brisa, asher yishchat, that says he will shecht it outside. Ainli el shochit pehem. How do I know? In other words, this only comes to include a person who shechts an animal, shachat oaf minalan. How do I know the halacha of a person who slaughters an oaf? Tamalomar, oh asher yishchat. You see very clearly, asher yishchat comes to include a bird. Now it goes on. Yachaf amalek. I would have thought that even if a person does malika on a bird, outside the halacha is, he would be chayiv for, I guess let's call it malikas chotz. V'dinu. Why would I think so? I make the following kavachomer. Mash shchita de'ein derech asher b'fnim. Let's look at shchita. The person goes ahead and shechts a bird inside the Beis Hamikdash. The halacha is, it's not kosher. And still, he's chayiv if he does it outside. Malika shederach asher b'fnim. Malika, which is exactly the proper way to go ahead and make a bird kosher inside. Wouldn't you say you'd be chayiv for doing that outside as well? Tamalomar, no. Zeh davar. Only this is the way to do it. And that comes to include only shchita b'achotz, not malika b'achotz. According to Kiva, so he'll say that zeh davar is needed for gzer shava, so don't worry about it. It's needed for an unrelated gzer shava, which is in nedarim, which has to do with hataras nedarim and hataras nedarim, the ability to be matir nedarim. And it has to do with the fact that when a person wants to be matir neder, it says Aaron Ubanav to tell you, I don't know the exact drasha, but something along the lines that you don't have to have you could have a bezdin shel hadyotim. When a person wants to do hataras nedarim, you don't have to have a bezdin of mumchim. You can just take 3 guys from shul and create a bezdin for hataras nedarim. Again, that's not really our sugya, but the point is he uses it for gzeira shava, which is not relevant to our discussion. Okay, so now we've covered muktari pnim, processed karbanos inside that were burned outside. Now we also covered the halacha of zrika, exactly how we know that zrika b'chutz is going to be a problem. I know we went back and forth with a bunch of different drushes. It's hard to keep all of it in mind, to remember exactly how it goes. But again, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva learned it from either from Zevach or from Damei Chashev, and then there was the residuals that came out from that. If you've used Zevach, so then what are you going to do with Damei Chashev? And if you use Damei Chashev, you can do it with Zevach. And that was the Gemara that we just learned, that each one of those Mount Amrim went ahead and learned their respective drushes from the words that was left over from the other one's previous drusha. Now the Gemara goes on. The V'had Tanat. That which we've learned, HaKometz, a person does a kometz, takes a scoop with his fingers. V'makabel dam b'chutz, a person who's makabel the blood outside, pater. He's pater. In other words, here we have a case where a person's not chayiv for, let's call it shchutei chutz. In other words, kabbalah sadam done outside. So again, a person shechts the carbon outside, there's a problem with shkutei chutz. Another person goes ahead and kabbalah the blood, or that same person is kabbalah the blood, no problem with kabbalah stam b'chutz, there's no problem with malika b'chutz. The Gemara says, Minalan. How do I know that there's no problem with kabbalah stam b'chutz? Now, what do you think the Gemara is going to ask? The Gemara immediately responds and says, in other words, what's the default position? Is the default position that you're always going to be chayiv? That you have to have a drasha to tell you that you're pater? Or is the default position that you're pater, and therefore you have to have a drasha to tell you that you're chayiv? Up until now, we're searching for an azhara and for an owner to tell you that you're chayiv, and pitam, the Gemara over here asks, hold on, where's the source that tells you that you're pater for Kabbalah Saddam and for Komet? So the way the Gemara asks this is, umihecha tesi dechayiv. Now in yeshivish lingo, mehecha tesi is used all the time to say, basically, how do you know? But the truth is, mehecha tesi doesn't mean how do you know. Mehecha tesi means from where are you learning this from? In other words, the Gemara understood it must be that we're learning this from someplace. So mehecha tesi, from where are you learning this from? In other words, you must have had some drasha in your mind that you're thinking of that's telling you why you would have been chayiv. So Gemara wants to know, mehecha tesi, where are you learning it from that would tell you that you're chayiv? Gemara says, maybe tesi mishchita. Maybe you learn that from shchita. The Gemara says, well, shchita is different. Shchita has its own individual characteristics, because mala shchita shekein selas shelo la'ochlin b'pesach. Shchita is something which is unique. It has such a strong power in the carbon. And if you had the wrong guy in mind when you're shechting a carbon pesach, for some reason this person is not included in the carbon pesach, for whatever reason, he's not included, and you shecht it for that person, guess what? It ruins the carbon. So again, but that's not going to be true by Kabbalah Saddam. The person has in mind when he's accepting the blood, he's catching the blood, the wrong person's not going to ruin it. So therefore, you can't compare the halachas of shchita to Kabbalah Saddam. They're just simply incomparable. So therefore, you wouldn't be able to learn it from there. So the fact that there's an issur shchita of shkutei chutz, by slaughtering it, by shechting it, does not necessarily mean that there's going to be an issur of Kabbalah's chutz. All right, so tasting is zrika. Maybe you want to learn that from zrika. That's the other drasha that we just learned before this morning. We have a source from Dami Chashev or Ozevach to tell you that Zrika B'chutz is going to be a problem. So maybe you want to learn Kabbalah B'chutz from Zrika B'chutz. Gemara says, no. Mal Zrika Shekein Zar Chayev Alel. Zrika is something which if a Zar does it, then he's going to be Chayev. Sorry, I left that last which came Zar Chayev Alel Misa. Look at the last Rashi on the page. Masha Ein came B'Kmitza B'Kabbalah. When it comes to Kmitza and Kabbalah, there's no Chiyuv Misa for a non-Kohen doing it. And Rashi explains, the Be'inan Avoda Tama, V'lo Avoda Sheyesh Acharei Avoda. For a Yisrael to be Chayev for doing an Avoda, it has to be a complete Avoda, which is not contingent on something else. But both Kmitza and Kabbalah are really a step in the process, and therefore there's no chiyuv. So therefore, to learn from Zrika, which is the final avoda in the four-step process, to learn from Zrika to Kabbalah, you wouldn't be able to do. So therefore, again, we still don't know, why did you think that Kabbalah would be an issue? Gemara suggests, tasting me be now. Maybe you learn it from both of them. In other words, maybe we'll make something called like a matzah. And we'll make it tzara shava. And we'll say, if you look at Rashi at the top explains it, because Gemara doesn't articulate it. And Gemara says, Teisimi binaya, mishkita uzrika. If you're going to ask the first question, if you're going to point out that shkita, you can't compare it to Kabbalah because that shkita ruins if you have the wrong people in mind. The Pesach Zrika Tachiach. Look at Zrika. It doesn't have that characteristic. Then you'll say, oh, Mal Zrika Shkin Zar Chayv Ala Misa. Well, Shkita Tachiach. Shkita is one of those cases where Zar is actually allowed to do Shkita. V'chazr Hadin. It's going to go around and around. Tzad Hashovash Behem. Shein Avodah V'chayav Aleim. Both of them are Vodos. V'chayav Aleim V'chutz. Achani Avi Kmitza V'Kabbalah. Shein Avodah V'chayav Aleim V'chutz. In other words, you may have said, I'll just look at what's the common denominator between Shkita and Zrika. The commonality there is, both of them are avodos, and both of them, if done outside, are a problem. So therefore, I'll say komets and Kabbalah Saddam are also avodos. If they're done outside, you're going to be chayiv. I would suggest stopping to drink right now. just a quick reminder, the fast is beginning. So the Gemara says, maybe that's what you'll do. What you'll do is, I know it's a little bit earlier than the Zman, but it's worthwhile giving yourself an extra minute. So I think the Olam has been, Baruch Hashem, energized by the coffee, by the daf. So I think at this point in time, it would be a good time to stop drinking. So the Gemara says, hold on, if you're going to be able to do that, im kain lo yomar bizrika, if that's true, that you can just pull two of them together and make this common denominator and learn to the third one, so then lo yomar bizrika. We don't have to have a special drush to tell you that there's a chiyuv of I guess, zrika bachotz, v'teisim yibinaya. You learn that from two different things. In other words, we'll say as follows: v'teisim shchita. We'll learn it from shchita, but then you'll say mal shchita shekein nesel shlosh shem ochlin. The Pesach teisim miha'ala. You learn it now from ha'ala. When a person brings something up onto his back and he has a wrong person in mind, that's not going to be an issue. So then, well, there's something unique about a mincha about ha'ala that it's relevant to a mincha. In other words, you do the same thing, and you make this chazra din, they'll go around and around and around, it'll circle around, you say, what's the bottom line? Both ha'ala is an avoda, and shchita is an avoda, so you just learn that to zrika. The Gemara says, Lahachi ksiv kra lamemar delo asmi binaya. In other words, that's why the pasuk actually teaches you specifically that there's a chiyuv when it comes to zrika, to tell you that no, we're not going to do that. In other words, what the bottom line is that we're not going to create this tzara shava. We're not going to create this commonality, this common denominator over here. So what are we left with? Left with mehecha teisi. Why would you think that you are chayiv when it comes to Kabbalah Sadam or to Kmitza? We don't have any place to learn it from, and therefore, since we have no place to learn it from, that's why it's going to be potter. Amar Bavo, Shachat v'zarak l'divrei Rabbi Yishmael chayiv achas, divrei Rabbi Akiva chayiv shtayim. Why does he say this? So again, on the previous daf, according to Rabbi Yishmael, where did we learn zrika from? We learned it from, according to Rabbi Yishmael, the word dam yechashev. And according to Rabbi Akiva, we learn it from o zevach. So therefore, says Rabbi Vo, shachar v'zark l'divrei b'shmael chayivach. According to Rabbi Yishmael, that you learn it all out from the same word. So you only chayiv once. According to Rabbi Akiva, it's a separate drasha, so there'll be a separate chayiv for shchita and for zrika. Aryeh disagrees and says, no, afilu divrei Rabbi Akiva, even according to Rabbi Akiva, enu chayiv al achas, you only chayiv one. Do makra sham tasa. The pasuk writes sham tasa. The pasuk says ki b'makim yivchar Hashem b'achat sherecha sham tala olasecha v'sham tasa. It says sham tala olasecha v'sham tasa. The Gemara explains hakasav asan l'kulan avoda achas. The pasuk went ahead and combined them together to make them one avoda, and therefore you only chayiv once. So even though it's learned from a separate word, nevertheless it's only one chayiv. Gemara goes on, Zarak vehela. What if a person did zrika and ha'ala? So he sprinkled the blood and he brought it up to this bech. According to Divrei Bishmal, chayiv shtayim. According to Bishmal, he'll be chayiv twice, because again, it's not the same word. It's not the same word that's learned. For shchita, the word is different for the zrika and for the ha'ala. Divrei Akiva in the chayiv alachas. According to Akiva, only learning it once. The Gemara says again, Aryeh responds and says, no, I feel Divrei Akiva chayiv shtayim. Even according to Akiva, you will be chayiv two separate isurim for a person who does zrika bachotz and ha'ala bachotz. Why? L'hachi palginu kra sham tala v'sham tasa. That's why the pasuk split it to tell you that there's two separate chiyuvim for the ha'ala and for the processing and the sprinkle of the blood. Then the Gemara says at the end, shachat v'zarak v'hela. If you can do shchita, zrika, and ha'ala, all three things are done outside. Divrei Akal chayiv shtayim. According to everybody, you'll be chayiv two separate chiyuvim for the shchita, the zrika, and the ha'ala. Tana Rabbanan. There's a lot of parentheses and brackets over here, so we're going to skip the parentheses and we are going to include the brackets. Tana Rabbanan. The pasuk says, michutz lemachane. Person shechts at michutz lemachane. Again, this is pasuk gimel. What does it say? Ish mi beis Yisrael asher yishkat share kesef v'ez b'machane, o asher yishkat michutz lemachane. So the pasuk says, michutz lemachane. Yachol, I would think that in order for a person to be chayav for shchutei chutz, for a person to be obligated to either bring a carbon or to be chayav kares, if he shechts the carbon outside the azara, I would say yachol chutz l'shalosh machanos. He has to go all the way out of all three machanos, like we mentioned by the parman and strafim and the must go outside all three machanos. I would think for there to be a chayav or shchutei chutz, you got to go outside all three camps. Tamalom, where the pasuk says no. O eis b'machane. It says in the machane. So clearly we see that it's not just a chiyuv of shechting it michutz lamachane. It's even if it's in the camp, but it's outside the azar, it's going to be a problem. Now skip the parentheses again. Iba machne. If it only says the word machne, yachal, I would think hashochet ola b'darim yechayiv. I would think a person shechts a carbon ola inside the Beis Hamikdash, but he shechts it in the south instead of the north. Remember, clearly we discussed that when it comes to Kadshei Kadashim, they need shchitas tzafon. They have to be shechted in the northern part of the Azara. So now I might think, once it tells me that there is a chiyuv for shchutei chutz, in other words, it's considered shechting a carbon outside of the domain where it's allowed to be shechted if you shecht it in the machne. So I would think the machne includes inside the Beis Hamikdash as well. The point just is you shecht it in the wrong place, so this would be wild. Person shechts a carbon inside the Beis Hamikdash, but the carbon shecht in the wrong place. Not only is the carbon disqualified, but the guy's chayiv kares for doing it. Tamalon, the pasuk says no, that's not true. Oh, el michutz lamachne. The pasuk says, "Oh, el michutz lamachne." And we make a drasha. Machutz lamachne. In other words, inside the camp and outside the camp are compared to each other. Machutz lamachne miyuchad. What's special about outside the camp? She'ein roy l'shchitas kachim u'l'shchitas kol zevach. You can't shecht any kachim or any carbonos over there. Yotza darom, that excludes shechting a carbon in the south side of the Beis Hamikdash in the Azara. In other words, that's not included in the Isser of Shchutei Chutz. She'af al pi she'ein roy l'shchitas Kadshei Kadashim, even though that's not the appropriate place for a person to be shechting a carbon ola, nevertheless, roy l'shchitas Kachim kalim, and therefore, even though the carbon may have its own issues because it was shechted in the wrong place, that's not going to be a violation of Shchutei Chutz if a person shechts a carbon ola in the south side of the Azara. Amar Ula. Ula teaches us, Hashochet al gago shel heichal. A person climbs up to the roof of the heichal. So remember our picture over here that you have in that T kind of structure over there, that building where the Kodesh and Kadshei Kadashim are, that was a structure that had a roof. So what happens if a person climbs up onto the roof and he shechts his carbon over there? Is that considered to be Shchutei Chutz, or is that not considered Shchutei Chutz? So it says, Ula, Shochet Ola, Gago Shel Heichal, Chayiv, he is Chayiv for shechting it on the roof of the Heichal. Hayol, the Ein Roy L'Shchitas Kol Zevach. As we just got finished saying, the characteristic that defines Shchutei Chutz is that it's a place that's not appropriate for any carbon to be shechted. Now, the roof of the Heichal is not an appropriate place to shecht the carbon. Therefore, according to Ula, a person would be chayiv for shechting a carbon over there. Rav asked a question on Ula. If that's the case, that shechting it on the roof would be a problem. Richter, let the pasuk write michutz lamachne. Just write the word michutz lamachne, because again the pasuk says asher yishchat shara kesef v'eiz ba'machne o asher yishchat michutz lamachne. So says Rava, nichtav kra michutz lamachne v'loy bayi. You will not have to have the next pasuk which says vel pesach ol hamoed lo hevio. Does not bring it inside to the ol hamoed. Then, in other words, v'lo bayi pesach ol hamoed. The Gemara reiterates el pesach ol hamoed lamali. Why does the next pasuk say he did not bring the opening of the Ol Moed? Lav l'meute gagai. Isn't the next pasuk which says Pesach Ol Moed lo avio? Isn't that coming to exclude the roof of the Heichal from the Isser Shchutei Chutz? In other words, it will exclude it from the prohibition of Shchutei Chutz, which essentially means you're going to include it into being a proper place to shecht. The Gemara then immediately flips on Rava and says, well, Rava, hold on a second. If that's what you want to say, Nichtov el Pesach Ol Moed, if the point is that anytime you bring it inside to anywhere which is inside the Ol Moed, even the roof of the Heichal, Nichtov el Pesach Ol Moed, B'machna, Rashi switches the order of this, but it's the same thing. Now, why does it have to say B'machna and Mechutz L'machna? The Gemara says, Lav, La Suye Gagai, isn't that coming to include the Gag, the roof that's also considered to be Shchutei Chutz? Amar of Mari, no, La Suye Kula B'fnim, those words come to include a case where the animal is entirely inside the Azara, V'tzavara B'chutz, the animal's neck is outside. The Gemara says, hold on. If that's the case, Tzavara B'chutz Pshita, everybody agrees if the neck of the animal is outside the Azara, it's going to be a problem. Why? Because on my cup of Rachmana, what is the Torah worried about? Ashkita. It's called Shchita B'chutz, Shchutei Chutz. On my cup of Rachmana, what's the Torah concerned about? It's concerned about Shchita, the Shchita B'chutzi. If the neck is outside, then Shchita was done outside. Rather, according to Rava, what's it coming to include? It's coming to include El Lasuye Kula B'chutz, the animal is entirely outside. It's Avara B'fnim. So in other words, it's not coming to include necessarily the roof. It's coming to include a case where the animal is mostly outside, but its neck is inside. Still, that will be a problem, according to Rava. So now we've defined what's considered Shchutei Chutz. The bottom line, Shchutei Chutz is anywhere outside the Azara. We have this interesting case where it's partially outside, partially inside, and then this machlokas about shechting the carbon on the roof of the Heichal. Itmar, the Gemara goes on, Hamala bezman hazeh, person brings the carbon nowadays outside. In other words, the premise of this is that it's only considered to be Shchutei Chutz if there is a pnim. If there is a pnim, then it's considered outside. In other words, outside is always going to be relative to there being an inside. So Gemara wants to know, how about Bizman Hazeh? Nowadays we have no Beis HaMikdash. The person brings the carbon outside on a private bama. Is that considered Shchutei Chutz? B'Yochanan says, Chayiv. Yes, you are Chayiv. Rish Lakish says, Potter, no, there's no chiyuv for Shchutei Chutz nowadays outside the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara explains, Yochanan says you're chayiv. Why? Because Kedusha Rishona, the initial Kedusha that was imbued upon the Beis HaMikdash, is Kitchel L'Shaita, it was given for that time, V'Kitchel Yatzid Lavo, and it goes on forever and ever, and therefore, since the Kedusha is there, that's considered an inside, and therefore relative to the inside we have an outside, which would create a chiyuv for Shchutei Chutz. Rish Lakish says, no, your patri was Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel L'Shaita v'lo Kitchel L'Shaita. The initial Kedusha was given for that time, but it's not there forever, including now. Gemara says, name of the plukted Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shuk. Maybe the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish is dependent on a different machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shuk. It's now, if we learned in the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Kishayu Bonin Behechel, when they're building the Heichal, Hayu Osin Kloim Behechel, they put curtains up in the Heichal. They put Klaim Bazaros, they put other curtains in the Azara. What was the difference though? When they put the curtains inside the Heichal, Bonim Bachutz, they would build it from outside, because once they put it up, then as soon as they finish, they're standing inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. You can't just be standing there. So therefore they have to stand outside and put it up. Ubazara, when they put the curtains around the Azara, Bonim Bifnim, they built it from inside because there was no problem for these Kohanim to stand inside the Azara. Amr Yeshua Shemati, I heard Shayi Makrivan Alf Pish Ein Bayis. V'ochlin Kachim Kadashim Alf Pish Ein Klaim. He says, no, you don't have to have those curtains. And Kachim Kalam Ma'aser Sheni Alf Pish Ein Choma, you could eat Kachim Kalam Ma'aser Sheni even though there's no wall around Yerushalayim. Why? B'nei Kedusha Rishona Kitchel L'Shaita Kitchel L'Asad Lavo. Lav Mechlal, doesn't that imply that the first opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, the reason why he said you have to have these curtains is because Rabbi Eliezer Savar Lo Kitcha. No, it's not there. It's not sanctified forever. Amar Le Ravina responded, Amar Le Ravina Ravashi, Mimai, who said, maybe everybody agrees that the Kedusha is there even forever. Umar Amar. Rabbi Eliezer was just telling us what he heard, how they built it. He wasn't telling us a halacha of Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel L'Shaita, Kitchel L'Salevo, whether the Kedusha is there forever or not. Umar Amar. He just was repeating what he learned. So why did they put up these curtains? If the curtains were not there to create the kedusha, why would they put up there? Gemara says that should be done with tznius. Again, tznius means it should be done with dignity. Don't just bring karbanos in public. It's something which is done in private. I just think it's appropriate to mention right now. 3 minutes left in the shir. Today is the Asara B'Teves. We're mourning, as we're going to say in Slichos in a few minutes. Basir lachodesh samach melech bavel v'tzar al ir kodesh. They besieged the city. The whole Slichos we're talking about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. How does our Gemara end off today? Gemara ends off today saying there's no machlokas. Everybody agrees the kedusha rishona, the sanctity of the Beis Hamikdash, what's kitchel l'shaita, the kitchel l'yasad lavo. Everybody agrees the kedusha is still there today, and therefore I think it's appropriate for us to remember, as we say the slichos today. Amru l'chu nechali v'nashpisa zichram. I'm going to say this just in a few minutes. Let's go ahead and destroy our enemies. V'nashpisa zichram. Wipe out their memory. Kelkana v'nokim gumlim yisu es shivram kamaseim shalem v'yevoshim yishivram. Ultimately, fight our wars for us. Bring back the Beis Hamikdash. And all the way at the end, it says at the end of that slicha, miyagom v'anacha pedei kelas nafshi aselam an hanacha malki ukdoshi tapoch l'ravacha es tzom hachamishi. Mertz Hashem. What do those last few words mean? We should be mehapech, turn over l'ravacha. Ultimately, to celebration, miyagon va'anacha pedei tel nafshi. Akadosh Baruch Hu should take us out of our sadness. Flip over the fast of the Tzom HaChamishi, l'sasun l'simcha tzom ha'raviv tzom ha'asiri. All the 10 Esim should be turned over to Yom Tovim, to Moadim. And it's a good thing for us to remember, as the Gemara tells us, the Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel L'Shaita, the Kitchel L'Asadlavo, the Kedusha is still there. It's just waiting for us. Emir Tzashem Achakala V'chayom Shiyavu Ishbizocha, that this should be our last fast that we should be observing. Maybe we won't even make it through the whole fast. Mashiach will come and bring us the Geula Shalema, the Mhera, the Karav. Have a wonderful day.